Steve, as many of you know, is a well-read Business Week writer. He cares deeply about this space. He has a blog which covers global trends, including those trends that have to do with the SGB space. So he's been a great help to us as we think about interacting with other folks in the media and the press about this, and is a voice for a lot of the issues that we care about. And he is going to be interviewing Michael Chu, who I suspect many of you know, has been an entrepreneur and a pioneer in the space, both in microfinance and in social and growing, or small and growing businesses and entrepreneurship support. So we're eager to get his perspectives on what things we can learn from the microfinance industry, what things he sees going forward, and any other wisdom he may want to impart. So with that, take it away.
That's great. Good to be up here with you, Michael.
Very good to be here with you.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off, I spent some time reading your bio, which is quite lengthy.
And that's what you get.
Right. And, but it was just amazing to think about all the things you've done in the past, but also all the things you're doing right now. A lecturer at Harvard Business School, managing director of IGNIA, an investment fund, advisor to Pegasus, a more traditional private equity fund, and also the co-leader of Antares project, which is kind of related but going off in another direction. So I just thought it would be fascinating to start off by finding out how the heck do you balance all these things? How do you weave them together?
Well, thank goodness for broadband internet and the Ted Williams Tunnel to Boston's Logan Airport. And actually, one of the things, because days have 24 hours, when I launched the IGNIA Fund, what it did mean was that I went to my partners and friends at Pegasus, and they've always been very tolerant with all my things and very patient with me, and basically said to them, I'm going to withdraw from the day-to-day of Pegasus so I could devote time to IGNIA and the business school. I think another secret is what I do in the business school is totally focused on exactly the same thing I do at IGNIA, which is the intersection of business and low-income sectors. So it's all...
You've got synergies.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so it's working that way. So to go back in history then, or partway into your history, at Accion, you were really, you and your colleagues were innovators in basically taking an idea, microfinance, and taking it and commercializing it and scaling it, and with tremendous successes that we've seen over the years. So my question for you is basically, is this what you envisioned when you guys started off? Did you have this idea that this you could get this kind of scale? And has it fulfilled the hopes that you had for it back then?
Well, I think I'm a lucky person in many things. But one of the very lucky ones is that not too many people get to see something that they imagined being much more than they imagined. Now, I've just come back from Arequipa, Peru, where there was a meeting of, every year, the IDB puts together a meeting of microenterprise and microfinance. And to see a Mi Banco of Peru, which, I remember negotiating with Fujimori and the vice president of Peru, the formation of Mi Banco, and this wasn't too long ago. To now have this bank have 500,000 clients, being one of the most profitable banks in the banking system, and hosting one of the receptions at Arequipa, that was fantastic. And it's mirrored in Banco Sol in Bolivia, it's mirrored in Compartamos in Mexico. So I think Compartamos in Mexico not only did an IPO that many of you are aware, but it's been incorporated into the index of the Mexican Stock Exchange.
Right, so it's establishment now, right?
And that's right. And Steve, I would love to say to you that I saw all this.
Yeah.
But actually, I remember saying when we were forming the group to start Compartamos, and people were assembling what was incredibly difficult at that time, $6 million. I said, one day, maybe, one day, this might be worth 60 million. And of course, when it did its IPO, it was valued at 1.5 billion. And this is a bank that serves nothing but low-income people. So it gives me particular pleasure also to be here at ANDE, because I think ANDE is also beginning another journey of great vision, but it's starting. So
Yeah.
it's a great privilege to be here with you all.
So is high impact investing and the kind of projects that these people are working on, are they today where microfinance was 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or is there a nice parallel there? Or
Well, I
how would
think
you
there is a parallel in the sense that the journey is beginning.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things that I think is important is what Pam Flaherty mentioned at the beginning. We really are at the beginning of something that took microfinance 30 years. So when microfinance started, it was an absurd idea. And for a long time, we struggled with what I think of as the 3 I's. First of all, there was indifference. And a lot of people just you couldn't meet with them because this was such a crazy idea. And then there was a lot of ignorance. There was absolute ignorance. People thought, you know, poor people, they need subsidy, they'll never pay, etc. And that led to incredulity, because you could go and say, you know, here are my numbers, and they say, I don't believe any of this. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you all are doing at ANDE is the stage we're in today is the beginning of the long march. So if anybody is here for this Sunday jaunt in the park, you're in the wrong room. This will require the commitment and dedication to travel the whole road, except that because things like microfinance have happened, I think, and some of it was discussed this morning, that already ANDE is doing some things that took microfinance a long time to do. So that trip it will be long, but if we're all doing our job right, it'll be much shorter.
So there'll be some shortcuts that can be taken along the way. And some of those, conceivably, and that's why we're here today, will be because there are lessons that can be learned from the journey of microfinance that can be applied now. So, you know, what are those lessons? What are they kind of on the highest level? And then we talked a little bit before about operationally, how do you make them, how do you apply them?
I think there are some important ones. And what I thought might make sense is to try to articulate the big key insights, but then also have us all think of how to make operational those big insights in terms of ANDE. You know, I've heard a little bit last night, some this morning, of many of you sort of saying, you know, how can we get to where microfinance is today? And a lot of it is, you know, microfinance is so well known, it's so accepted, there's public recognition, it's in the decision makers, the press knows about it, funding seems to be very plentiful. And I think the first key thing is, you know, some of these things that you admire about microfinance, some are means and some are ends. And some are means that are very important because they're in the critical path, and some are means, but they may not be so important. So actually, I think if you think about microfinance, a great lesson of microfinance is trying to separate what is ends and what are means. And within that, what is really key. And I don't think you can do that unless you define what success is, which I think ANDE will have to do. Because success in microfinance may not be the fact that, you know, Queen Sophia and Natalie Portman are involved with microfinance. Mm-hmm. And it's true, you know, I would never have sat next to Queen Sophia or Natalie Portman if it weren't for microfinance.
So it's worked for you, but...
So it certainly worked for me. And actually, if you look at what is key for microfinance, I think it's getting the widest array of financial services at the very cheapest price to the widest amount of people in the shortest amount of time. And if you then look at that as the definition of success, and you look at the history of microfinance, you'd say, well, if an ANDE had existed right at the beginning, if that was the definition of success, what would have been the key role of ANDE? And I think it would have been to say, if we agree that that is the success of microfinance, then we ought to be great enablers of the key things that you needed or you need to drive that to that goal, which is a mobilization of human resources, financial resources, but very importantly, intellectual resources. Because actually, when you look at the history of microfinance, the great models of deployment of microfinance, one of the results of their greatness and their power is that they become obsolete fast. That's the test of a great model. So actually, if you have successful development, if you are actually succeeding a lot, you have to change models all the time. And that's essentially what happened with microfinance in the span of 20 years. Because we went from people who were accused by developmental people in conferences as being totally heartless and the thought of charging not only interest, but actually interest that would cover costs was so absurd, and it was being pioneered by NGOs because nobody else would do it. But you know, we look at this period, NGOs gave way to connecting with capital markets, gave way to regulated financial institutions, gave way to equity funds because you had to form these institutions, gave way to guarantee funds, debt funds, then you have to worry about the regulatory framework. All this is happening, and at each point, the key constraint is being difficult. Now,
so it's like kind of like conceptual and operational agility required at the same time, and also kind of sharing of information. You talked about information. I forget exactly what you said, but it seemed like you were suggesting that if people are sharing these experiments as they're doing them, everybody learns faster.
And that, I think, those are the key things about the development of microfinance. And I say that because if you grant me that those maybe have been the key things that determine the success of microfinance as we see it today, you will then see from another optic a lot of things that you may have considered really great things, but which in my view were nice things, but weren't critical. For example, the Microcredit Summit. Some of us were remembering that when that happened in 97 or 96, I forget, it was tremendous. It got so many people involved. That's when I got to have dinner with Queen Sofia sitting next to me. And when you look at all that, which brought a lot of visibility, and a lot of people involved with microfinance felt it was such a great validation, and foundations that had supported microfinance also saw it as wonderful. Of course it was wonderful. But take a step back. Was it in any way key for the development of Bank Rakyat of Indonesia, one of the giants? I don't think so. Was it key for the development of BRAC, ASA? Was it key to the development of a Compartamos, Mi Banco, Banco Sol, Caja Los Andes, Procredit? I don't think so. So actually, the definition of success has to then drive what ANDE positions itself to do. And I think what is absolutely essential that ANDE do is contribute to the critical path of success. Now, how to make operational that insight. Should I launch into?
Yes, please do. You're on a tear.
Well, one of the key things of defining success is using terms that are powerful and and expansive rather than small and limiting. So one of the lessons of microfinance that I think is worth remembering, there was a time in microfinance, around the time of the first microcredit summit, by the way, in which this notion was advanced and advanced very effectively that anything above $300 is not microfinance, was advanced and accepted and adopted by a lot of people in the mass audience, including legislators who didn't know very much about microfinance. And that was such a disservice. And when you think about it conceptually, it makes absolutely no sense. Because all of us involved in all this, I never saw our task as taking somebody from being very, very, very poor to being very poor. It was actually to accompany all this. And you know, one of the things of development is infrastructure is lacking for everything. And so actually I've seen women that borrowed $125 and 4 years later needed $25,000 because they were so successful. And now I think ANDE, if you'll allow me to speak without filters and be a bit provocative, I understand why the terminology has changed and we are now dealing with SGB, small growing businesses. Let me propose to you that that may be a very limiting definition. Because immediately you say that, and I noticed in the room this morning, somebody said, well, small growing business, should it include medium or not? And some people said, of course. And somebody said, absolutely not. And then you start defining what is small, what is medium, and I think, though, that you get into something that microfinance fell into, which is how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And instead, and let me just propose, in order to start the thinking going, because there's no reason why I would have a better definition than any of you, but just to try to illustrate what I mean in terms of trying to define success a little bit differently. If you look at small and growing business, maybe the real operating key definition there is not either small or growing, but business. If you think of business, you're really talking about commercial entities, because if not, it's not a business. Commercial entities are market mechanisms. So maybe you're talking about market mechanisms that are poised to contribute in a significant way to those areas that have a disproportional impact on the life chances of people. Because that links it to things like poverty, environment, education. And it does leave some other things out. But I think when you have a definition that includes everything, it may not include anything. And so I think some focus in that direction may be helpful, because then also, as Pam reminded us, language does matter. And if you want people to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and come running with you, it helps if you say, you know, we're training to beat these other guys at squash, so we'll get up at 5 in the morning. Because if you just say, come and run with me at 5 in the morning, it's difficult. So if you say, come and help me propel small and growing businesses, I think you need something sharper. And then if you define success based on that, and you have to define what it is, then you can sort of say, what is critical path to that? And it may have nothing to do with everybody knowing about what you're doing, but has everything to do with key people knowing what you're doing. And if the key people are, I don't know, if it's Wall Street, if it's key decision makers in certain countries, if it's key people in whatever place you think is hitting a constraint, and by the way, this will change with time, then that becomes what ANDE should focus on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my thought about the definition here is that I haven't seen it being too narrow, because the small growing business terminology seems to be positioned against microfinance. You understand microfinance, right, but that's not enough. Absolutely. You've got to do it here. And one thing that just from talking to a few people this morning, it was clear that different groups had different kind of slices of these markets above microfinance that they were looking at, and they say, oh yeah, we do this, and Acumen does this, and so and so else does this. So what occurred to me was, in terms of definition, people have to pick their slices, right, but the key thing is being able to help each other hand off, because knowing what somebody else is doing, saying, well, we're going to take you to this level, but if you need this other level of help or this other level of financing or preparation for, eventually an IPO, the grand kahuna there, here's the handoff that would be a path for you. So it's not like people getting stuck on a strata where they start. So, but I'm a little vague here on exactly, because you seem to be saying you need more definition, but also you don't want to be straitjacketed. So could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Exactly. Sure. Absolutely. So I think by focusing on the business rather than small and growing, I think is expansive, but at the same time, it focuses the dialogue. We don't mean things that are not business. We mean commercial.
You don't mean a sole proprietor.
Commercial market mechanisms.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And then when you go and look at, and basically what ANDE is trying to do is create the ecosystem that is key for this to survive and grow and prosper. Mm-hmm. Now within that, I think you're absolutely right. Another lesson from microfinance is that, Tom Easton, your colleague from The Economist, wrote a piece that I thought was really terrific about 5 years ago on microfinance. And one of the things he said that struck me was, he said, from afar, this seems like a great industry, everybody's together. But when you go and talk to specific people, nobody agrees with anybody else. Well, as you develop ANDE, of course, you have to capture that richness, particularly as people have many different ideas, and it would be wonderful if it were all complementary stages. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that they're complementary stages, and they're different versions, right, of what people think. Now, the important thing is not to try to push to any orthodoxy.
It's not a planned ecosystem. It's a nice chaos,
the ecosystem,
right? Yeah.
In order to progress, needs to have different plants, and then nature and success and time will show which plant is sturdier. Mm-hmm. So the ecosystem will sort itself out. But as we engage with different ideas, I think two things. It's important to have them all come. But the second thing is, I think it's a mistake to have a policy that says anybody's fine, we're absolutely welcoming, so anything that is said or perspective that is given is fine. Actually, it's fine only if you bring in the discourse rigor of analysis and depth of concept. So it doesn't matter if an entity is new or old, or if somebody comes with something that is totally different. I hope there are members here that have different perspectives on where, even if they're in the same space.
Right. So an openness to different points of view, but demanding back up your ideas with some facts.
The dialogue,
okay.
a substantive dialogue.
Okay.
So I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes. And certainly, you know, taking another example from sort of the microcredit summit, there were at that time hugely different approaches, as there continues to be today in terms of microfinance. One thing is to say, you know, because we're in front of the world, let's show our best and, you know, paper the differences. And people say, no, we're all banks and we're all, yes, and we're profitable. But raging behind it is positions that came out in the Compartamos IPO. Some people think the Compartamos IPO is the best thing that ever happened to the poor in Mexico. Some people say this is disastrous. It is shameful. Okay, we ought to have this discussion, but not emotional discussions, not discussions that are low in quality. We should have a high intellectual caliber discussion of those issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. We, you know, Business Week did some investigative stuff on Azteca Compartamos a couple of years ago. I'm sure you saw the report.
I saw the article.
And what was interesting about it was, I mean, you know, there were abuses that were found, and there were problems that were found, and cases where people weren't succeeding. And our investigative team decided, well, this proves that this proves that microfinance is a failure globally. That was their conclusion. Fortunately, you know, cooler heads prevailed, and I was allowed to write more about it, as if there was still some hope there. But these are the kinds of hard positions that some people kind of take. We're about to open up for Q&A, and we have some.
Steve,
can
I
yes,
add
please,
a little bit to that?
Yeah.
Because if we at ANDE, and certainly in microfinance, open the door to market mechanisms, to introduce business to solving society's problems or helping to solve society's problems, it ought to come with a total realization that when we open the door to the power of business, we're also opening the door to the possibility of having such things as the subprime mortgage meltdown.
Sure.
And there's nothing in terms of microfinance that is wholly that would prevent that, and nothing for ANDE if it's introducing these business concepts to prevent it from that kind of thing also. So, and that's also part of the discussion that we need to have, because when you look at the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage meltdown, and other things, understanding the elements that drove us to that is part of understanding business. And understanding business is part and parcel of what we're doing. Of course, we're reaching out because there's huge power in mobilizing it. And if we can mobilize that for some of society's problems, it's huge. But that's the kind of discussion that we ought to be having, and not the emotional one.
Yeah, I hear you. I want to get back to that in just a second, but I want to put everybody on alert that we want a lot of questions from the floor, but I'm going to ask one more question of you that goes right to that last thing, which is talking about debates, emotional discussions. So Mohammed Yunus was in town for the CGI last week, and I spoke to him. I always enjoy speaking to him. And he came in, and you know, the positions have not changed. His position has not changed. He believes that you should not make money off of poor people, and he has very precise definitions of what he thinks is a fair interest rate. And beyond that, you're a loan shark. And it's, you know, he allows a little bit of gray area. There's kind of like there's the green, the gray, and the red. So obviously you disagree, but I think it'd be great to hear you say why that's too limited a definition.
At the heart of this, I disagree, because I don't think that the suggestions that Mohammed Yunus has made, that you just described, are grounded on analysis. So they are essentially ideological definitions.
That's right.
And you can go through each one of those statements that you made, and they're really ideological ones. And I think just like $300 is microfinance and anything above it is not.
Sure.
So I think when we bring ideological definitions rather than empirical ones, actually it's very fundamental, because in a sense, when we let ideology define it, we are saying it's our point of view that should prevail. It's either Michael Chu's point of view or Steve's or Muhammad Yunus's. But when we deal with the space that we're dealing with, and in my particular case, what I'm concerned with is global poverty. I think the only perspective that's worth anything is the perspective from the eyes of the people in the streets. It's the people in the slums that really matters. And when they look at it, the discussion that we have, should institutions have charged more than 15% above their cost of funds? Should this be that? It's all referential to the people having this debate. For the people in the street, what do they care? Do you care if you go to CVS whether they're making 50% return equity or 5% return equity? What you care is they got the aspirin that you walked in to buy it.
Except there are very practical consequences if you're paying 100% interest rate.
Of course.
Yeah,
so the question is, another thing that we can all agree, and it's not ideological, it's empirical, is the cheapest rate for the poor is the best. Right? The poor will agree with that unconditionally. So the question is, if you look at any country, Mexico, there are 100 million people in Mexico. You could say that's roughly 10 million plus people. So the question is, and of course, 80% of them are not well served. So that's the market. If you think of getting the lowest rate, it's not the lowest rate for 1 million clients, which Compartamos has 1.3 million clients. So if Compartamos dropped its rate precipitously, there will be 1.3 million very happy Mexicans. But that's not the battle. The battle is 10 million Mexicans. So you got to say, what is going to provide the cheapest rate, the fastest rate possible to 10 million Mexicans? And for me, that's through the creation of an industry. And actually, after the IPO, there are now 800 institutions in Mexico engaged in microfinance in one way or another. And that is what is driving the rate down, because it's declining. And that is what will get it to the 100 million Mexicans. It's happened in Bolivia, and that I think is, of course I'm biased, but I think that's an analytical response to this. It's not ideological.
Yeah.
I come to this actually, personally, from the left. I would much rather this all be done by a government that works perfectly, that has the interest of the people at heart. When I go to business, it's not an ideological solution. For me, it's an empirical one.
Okay, great. All right. Over here. And there's a microphone. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm really interested in your establishing principles that help small and growing business sector, or the business sector as you define it, behave ethically, and have it ethically and be good business for the people that it serves. So, for example, in microfinance, just now, microfinance is arriving at things like the client protection principles. I'm wondering what possibilities you see for building in some structures so that we don't have the kind of global financial meltdown that you describe in the SGB sector.
Right. I do think that leadership matters a lot, and I think there's nothing to replace people in charge of institutions, whether they be the ANDE institutions or microfinance institutions, that have a high degree of integrity. Of course, I love the protection of rights of microfinance, etc. But for me, this is just an expression of intent. if you want to be very cynical, so let me be very cynical just as a matter of discussion. I think Bernie Madoff would be the first one to sign those statements, precisely because he's dishonest. So actually, what really, really changes, what really brings transparency effective in the markets is when a leader in that market says, this is my rate, this is very transparent. And if you want to know the rate of anybody else, I'll calculate it for you on the same basis. So it's apples to apples, and you can take a look at it. So for me, the role that leaders in an industry take has a lot of power. It doesn't matter what you sign or don't sign. It's the actual action. So there's nothing that is stronger than action. And that leads me to another point. You know, I just had, in this course that I'm teaching at HBS, we happen to be right in this module of microfinance. And the case that I taught before I came yesterday was the subprime mortgage meltdown in the States. And one of the discussions that I had with the students was, I said, you know, you can say who was at fault? And of course, 10 zillion parties are at fault. But one of the entities that people say is, you know, rating agency, the investment banks and all that. And I say to my students, wait, do you think that if you were hitting any of these institutions, the Bear Stearns, the Standard & Poor's or whatever, what do you think, why did they make the decisions they did? Were they stupid? Were they not people with integrity? What? Would you have made a different decision? And the question, and something that we ought to all remember is, actually, if somebody had stopped the train, if somebody had said, no, we're not engaged in that, what I reminded my students is that you would have been a hero. But you would have been a hero in retrospect, many quarters after you'd been fired.
Right.
Because everybody else of your peers would have been, you know, you would have looked so stupid. Well, that's part of what we're unleashing when we're discussing business. And we just have to be cognizant of that.
Straight in the back? And the microphone? Yeah.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for these comments. I'd actually like to pick up a bit on the discussion this morning when the donor agencies and the funders were sitting. And there was a question coming from a gentleman from TechnoServe, sort of asking about the role and support for nonprofit organizations that are really very central to helping to build markets. And when I think about, you know, Accion's role and the role of many of the international NGOs that were helping to develop models, and were really, they were like, you know, sharing technologies across one organization to the next. And I think about all your efforts serving on so many boards and bringing that expertise from one institution to the next. It seems to me that the TechnoServes, the INCOs, the many organizations that are really doing it from, and CEF, another really important leader, they're going to need support going forward. And the question becomes, how is it that microfinance was able to get the kind of attention at the different agencies and the different funders? Because that, to me, was like really one of the critical things that allowed this whole industry to flourish. I mean, we can all, I mean, how it is that there's now a CGAP, that USAID has an Office of Microenterprise. I mean, all this sort of donor infrastructure that was developed, where did that come from? Any insights that might be able to help us in this field?
Right. Let me try, because this takes me back to the times when I was CEO of Accion and looking at all this space. And when I look at what was really critical, what allowed us to do some of the things that were truly made a difference in the industry, I think the role of funders who acted as a lot like players in the commercial capital markets really made a big difference, versus acting as most funders who operate in the social, what I call the social enterprise capital markets, you know, how sources and uses meet in social enterprise. I think it is the most dysfunctional market there is. And it is so dysfunctional, actually, that it is a market that clears, actually, regardless of performance. And so what really allowed us to do the key things was the key support, sometimes from multilateral institutions, because I don't subscribe also that, you know, all the multilateral institutions, what they do is either A or B. Sometimes they do things that are really great, sometimes they do things that are terrible. But there were some institutions in philanthropy, foundations, and multilateral institutions that at different key moments, what they did was they operated in the following way. They said, we're interested in the development of microfinance or whatever. What we're going to take a look at is who is doing something that appears to be effective. And then we'll give them the backing. Instead of what 90% of the time happens, which is we're interested in microfinance. We think what ought to be done is A, B, C, and D. And now let's go and convince somebody to do A, B, C, and D. And particularly the good ones that we like, who actually think that we ought to be doing X and K, but we like A, B, C, and D. So let's try to convince them to do a bit of B and C. And that is a reality that institutions that depend on donors, this is the reality that we live in. My greatest shock when I went from KKR to Accion was one day waking up and realizing precisely this, that it didn't matter how good we did whatever it is that we were doing. That was unrelated to the revenue coming in. Now, this is so perverse that I think, for example, you know, we talked about, you know, some of the great things about Microfinance Summit, and didn't that bring money into the sector? Of course it did. But if it brings money into the sector that is not directed in the way that identifies good performance versus bad performance, then I think it's worse than not having it. Because when money comes and sloshes around without distinguishing good and bad performance, it actually hurts the good performance.
Muddies it, yeah.
Right. So I think it's absolutely key, Sherry, to go, sorry for this detour, but to support these institutions in a way that says, let us understand what you're doing. We like it, we don't. We don't fund it. But if you like it, then fund the whole effort. And funding the whole effort means the bill that pays for electricity, as well as the bill that goes for, you know, some great programs that are new, et cetera.
So, yeah, Willie Foote, Root Capital. So, Michael, question about just building on the theme of the subsidy that went in early on, whether or not it was based on performance or not in microfinance. Seems to be one of the big struggles that the SGB sector, or whatever you want to call it, faces relative to microfinance is that the brand was so marvelous and beautiful, built on that single woman seamstress and the single sewing machine, and that we struggle with how do you sell it, how do you talk about our space, and I think it's what drives, in the context of a broken social capital marketplace, some of these angels that we dance with, because truth is, when you're a small business versus a medium-sized business, based on the IFC, for instance, categories this morning, often you need public goods to sit next to the capital. You need to invest in capacity. You need that investment in human resources and technical assistance, and yet there are much fewer donor dollars today than there were 20 years ago when Grameen, in effect, could afford to scale and hit financial sustainability, not charging very high interest rates because there was just a lot of fat on the land in terms of what the donors would do. So you almost have to differentiate within the small and medium enterprise space to justify, by way of ANDE, the fact that you can't criminalize that stuff. You need the subsidy next to, subsidy's not the right word, as Pam said earlier, but you need the public goods next to the capital. So thoughts about that, where you don't want to be pointing fingers or anything in either direction, whether it's microfinance or medium-sized enterprise finance. But at the same time, you got to fight for, for that, the different flavors of money that are required.
Right. As somebody who was part of this growth stage of microfinance, microfinance wouldn't exist in the form it is today without the strategic access to donor funds, to grants. And you can look at institutions that today are wonderful institutions, and I don't exclude any of them in terms of Compartamos, Mi Banco, Banco Solidario, Banco Caja Los Andes. These all had their origins in NGOs that received a lot of support from donors, whether they were from philanthropy or public agencies or both. So the role of donors and investment in that sense is absolutely key, and I think it will be key for ANDE as it tries to build, and some of the things that we discussed was these support organizations that are building this. However, I think what is really important is that the funds that went to create that is a small subset of all the funds that were donated to microfinance. So there is a real importance in separating those donations that were really powerful and strategic, and the much larger piece that went to microfinance in that period and later that absolutely did nothing to
Not
advance
well deployed.
microfinance.
Hey, I want to do a follow-up just on what he said, because that iconic image of the woman and her sewing machine and economic self-determination, that obviously captured the attention of donors, of investors, of entrepreneurs, of young people. What iconic image could this group use that could be kind of like the brand for high-impact investing?
Let me tell you a true story. I went, some of you know Kurt Königsfest, the CEO of Banco Sol. Recently he said to me, remember my first day on the job? And I was chair of Banco Sol at that time. I said, no. He said, you and I went to visit clients. And I understood microfinance from that very first day. I said, oh, tell me more. He said, you and I went to visit this in El Alto, which is the poor part of La Paz. And we walked into this building. And we walked in, and it was a super duper print shop. It was full of Apple computers and really new equipment. Was printing out all that stuff. And we talked to the owner. And the owner actually described how he had old letterpress equipment about 4 or 5 years ago. And he literally cried when he described how Banco Sol loan made all this, and he owed all this to Banco Sol. And then, Kurt said, he stopped and said, are you the new general manager of Banco Sol? And I said, yes. He said, I'm so glad you're here because actually 3 days ago, the loan officer of a competitor bank came and offered me lower rates. I knew instantly. But what I'm trying to say,
the limits on gratitude.
What I'm trying to say is, what could be a better poster child that person who grew his business and is fantastically successful, and this is what we're talking about. So actually, there is an equivalent of the women surrounded by her pottery as selling. There is. We just have to express it in the way that we feel moved by the fact that you see a business coming out and somebody prospering and suddenly being successful. So we just have to use the right image.
Oh, okay, we'll go there.
Hi, Audrey from Rienta Capital. Some of us in this room are looking at businesses that require far less than $1 million, so really small businesses, and the number of exits where investors actually get to even protect their capital or get anything back out, as far as I know, are very few. We can probably count on one collective hand. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what constitutes the key criteria or for proof of concept that we can call this an asset class? And on an unrelated note, I'd like to know what you think of the terms venture philanthropy.
Let me start with the second one. I don't like the term venture philanthropy. I think partly it's because, when we've gone to raise funds for IGNIA, we found it very interesting that in this space of venture philanthropy, which you would think, a fund that invests in commercial enterprises, et cetera, would be fantastically welcome. Actually, what we discovered was that many people who intellectually bought into all this, when they said, and what kind of return do you expect? And we said, well, we're shooting for 25, 30%. The color would drain off their faces, and they really didn't want to pursue the conversation. Now, the point here is not 30% is good or bad. That we can discuss. What I think is that venture philanthropy continues to be a lot of philanthropy. And so I think it's a concept that, to me, is a bit muddies. I would much rather have a more precise terminology. Now, that's just personal preference. With regards to the proof of this being an investable category, I think and I take that to mean are funds that are devoted to this space really investable? I think we're still at the stage in which we're trying to prove that. There's the beginning of funds that are deployed that are going to put that to the test. And the proof will come when we see the results. This is the same at a stage in microfinance when we formed the first equity fund to go into microfinance, and people were saying, will this work? Won't it work? Well, today, I think there's a track record. So we're trying to establish the track record now. And again, this is the early stage. ANDE will come together 5 years from now. We'll come back 10 years from now. And hopefully there will be a track record, and for many, many reasons, for society and for selfish personal reasons, I hope you will have some real great examples of success. But the proof is in the pudding.
I'm Harold Rosen. I'm from the Grassroots Business Fund, and before this I was with the World Bank Group in the SME department and had the pleasure of dealing with Michael and some others. Michael, I think there's a couple of other things I would pose it to you as to why microfinance got so strong and why folks like Action got big. Is it not the case that you got command of your grant money? It wasn't just the presence of it, but the best players in the field like you and ProCredit managed to get friendly enough donors that you could actually get usable grant money, which was probably more important than just that it was there but hard to use. That means that you didn't get buffeted around like I suspect a lot of the people in this room that have the similar technical skills for this side of the space. That's one observation. The other is that the capital, those of you who were able to put together pools of capital, you were converted from being consultants to principals. That now Action's going through that, ProCredit's done it. Isn't it true that the best in the field of microfinance have gotten to become principals and not consultants? And that also is hard to see, just knowing now this side of the space a bit, that this is a terribly fragmented field. First, do you agree with that? And second, what do you propose ANDE could do about it?
Right. The first is I agree entirely with you that having funds to do as you wanted to do was absolutely critical. But let me say that I think the road there is not so much the key thing, of course, you mentioned having the trust and the relationship that you build with institutions that are willing to do that. That is true. But let me say something which comes together with that, which I think was equally as important. When you become a trusted party with funders, funders will often, and for the most understandable reason, will come to you with things that are hot on their agenda. And so they will say, we're good friends. Now, we would really love for you to go to, in our case, was Palestine. Now one of the important things is that, and I literally went through a thought process that concluded with this that I'm going to tell you. When I was head of Acción, I concluded that the most expensive money that we could receive was anything that made us diverge from our critical path. So regardless of the consequences, we would say, no, we can't do that. And
Even if it meant losing a funder?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes, I don't think the key ones we lost, but some key ones weren't as happy with us as if we had said yes. But actually, I thought it was absolutely key. So one has to come with the other. The second thing with regards to becoming principals, I think becoming principals was very important because you can't discuss things with partners. The discussion is very different if you're discussing it as partners or as just technical assistance providers. Now, technical assistance providers, if you want to be just that, is fine because the BCGs and McKinseys add tremendous value and they have a perfect role. But I think if you want to also be important in governance and direction and decision making, then I think being a principal does matter. Now, how to go about that? I think for ANDE, I think there's a real opportunity for ANDE because ANDE groups together many component pieces that make the ecosystem. You have here technical assistance providers, you have people that are practitioners, people that are consultants, and people that are funders, and you have funders that are foundations and funders that are multilateral institutions. It would be really high value added if ANDE somehow could engage all these pieces of the ecosystem in rigorous, frank, open discussions on these matters. And my hope is that the foundations and multilateral organizations that have many treasures themselves can work together to distinguish what is real high impact investing. And part of it may be to say to some institutions, this institution could do a lot of good in this stage of the development of the industry that we're discussing if it had this type of money. But often I think it's engaged in that discussion. Because if I look at in Acción's life, there were a couple of foundations and some of which are present in this room that provided, I think, the most strategic and the most difficult type of fund to get. And when I would go in for the periodic reviews, actually the question that would come was, don't tell me your latest successes, because we know you got plenty of successes. Tell me what's the biggest problem. What is really a thorny problem? And to have the trust that one could really have a real discussion on that. Not the usual, what's your problem? The problem is our staff is working very hard. But real problems. And then they'd say, how can we address that? But you have to develop such a trust that that's very difficult. But that is what ANDE, I think, can try to create in this ecosystem.